Thank you very much. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor and the privilege today to introduce one of the most beloved and admired American First Lady. For decades, Laura Bush has championed key issues in the fields of education, healthcare, and human rights. She has traveled to more than 76 countries, including 2 historic solo trips to Afghanistan, and has launched groundbreaking education and healthcare programs in the US and abroad. The author of best-selling memoir, Spoken from the Heart, Mrs. Bush also founded both the Texas Book Festival and the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. Today, as the chair of Women's Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute, Mrs. Bush continues her work on global healthcare innovation, empowering women in emerging democracies, education reform, and supporting the men and women who have served in America's military. Recently, Mrs. Bush authored the foreword to We Are Afghan Women, Voices of Hope in March 2016. The book chronicles powerful stories of courageous women in Afghanistan and the risks they face on their journey to build peaceful communities in their country. Born in Midland, Texas, to Jenna and Harold Welch, Laura Bush holds a degree in education and master's degree in library science. She taught in public schools in Dallas, Houston, and Austin, and worked as a public school librarian. In 1977, she married George W. Bush. President and Mrs. Bush are the parents of twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna, son-in-law Henry Hager, and proud grandparents of granddaughters Margaret Laura Mila and Poppy Louise Hager. The Bush family also includes 2 cats, Bobby and Bernadette. So I welcome Mrs. Bush to the stage.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mina. You can go sit there. Thank you very much, Mina. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for joining me today. Mina and I will have a conversation with Walter Isaacson in just a minute. I like it that my cats have made my introductions. Barney and Beasley and Spot. Spot that was born at the White House to Millie and died at the White House when we lived there. And then our 2 Scottish Terriers have all gone on to their greater reward, and now we just have 2 cats. Bob was a cat that came up to our ranch barn. As George said, last seen eating a rabbit at the ranch, next lying on our bed smoking cigarettes. That's the kind of cat Bob is. Thank you all. Thank you for your warm welcome. I'm happy to be here in beautiful Aspen for the Aspen Ideas Festival. But I thought before I get started, you might want to report on some of my family members. My father and mother-in-law, President George H.W. Bush and Barbara, are doing very well. We just spent a week with them to celebrate their birthdays. President Bush turned 92 on June 12th, and Barr turned 91 on June 8th. And they're both happy and in good spirits. George and I believe that they're showing us the way to age with grace. In Maine, my mother-in-law, Barbara, walked her dogs on the beach every day. Last summer, she walked with a walker, and this summer, she can't walk. From both of them, George and I have learned that all we know we have is now. So take advantage of your life as it is, and walk on the beach every chance you get. But of course, the best events we've celebrated are the births of our granddaughters, Mila, who's 3, and 10-month-old Poppy Louise. Mila and Poppy are perfect. And our daughter Jenna and our son-in-law Henry are thrilled although they have to be careful of being trampled by George and me in our rush to get our hands on the babies. Everyone has been asking us what our grandparent names are. Have you noticed that grandparents are now choosing special names for themselves? Maybe Grandpa and Grandma have gone out of style in a pretense that we're not really old enough to be grandparents. When I had Barbara and Jenna, my dad said, they can just call me their old pa, and that's what they did. But now it's sort of like choosing a name for your cat. Barbara and Jenna recently emailed that for no apparent reason, and I'm not kidding, they thought my grandparent name should be Mimi Maxwell. George just wants the babies to call him Sir. Jenna and her husband, Henry Hager, are enjoying life with their babies. Jenna's working as a contributing correspondent for NBC's Today Show. You may have seen her. George says she's just continuing the Bush family tradition of warm relations with the media. Jenna and I have just written a new children's book, Our Great Big Backyard, which celebrates the centennial of the National Park Service. Our daughter Barbara, who's participated in the Aspen Ideas Festival on other years, has founded a nonprofit called Global Health Corps that places recent college graduates in the health field in underserved areas. Her Global Health Corps fellows are at work in 3 cities in the United States and in 4 countries in Africa. You can learn more about Global Health Corps if you're interested, or if you know a young person who might be interested in becoming a fellow by looking on the web at ghcorps.org. George and I are proud of the work our girls are doing, and we're happy to be back home in Texas, living what I call the afterlife, in a state George calls the promised land. George has been working on his golf game and his painting. Did you know that he's become an artist in retirement? He's written a book about his dad, 41, A Portrait of My Father. It's a lovely tribute to a great man, and I encourage you all to purchase a copy. Remember, he's on a government pension. George and I are both devoting a lot of time to our work at the Bush Presidential Center on the campus of SMU in Dallas. And this gives me the chance to invite all of you to visit us there and tour the Bush Presidential Library and Museum. As part of the Bush Center, we've established the Bush Institute, a public policy institute that addresses the policy areas that were the most important to us when George was president. And as you might guess, there's an overriding theme of freedom. Freedom from ignorance, our education initiative. Freedom from disease, our global health initiative. Promoting free enterprise, our economic initiative. And we're supporting dissidents and political prisoners and democracy building around the world through our Human Freedom Initiative. George has a special program for the men and women of the United States military, and I'm chairing the Women's Initiative. I know that women can be catalysts for change in their countries, and that the well-being of women is essential to a good future for our world. Studies show that when you empower women, entire communities and countries thrive. We know from research that when mothers are educated, their children are more likely to be educated and successful. When women are included in the economy, countries are more prosperous. And when women are healthy, their families are healthy. The inclusion of women in all aspects of society strengthens and improves the stability of their countries. Investments in the success of women are investments that pay off. And with the Women's Initiative Fellowship, the Afghan Women's Project, which we're going to talk about today, the First Ladies Initiative, and our Global Health Initiative, Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon, the Bush Institute is investing in women. The Bush Institute's Women's Initiative Fellowship is designed to equip female leaders in Egypt and Tunisia with the knowledge to build strong civil societies. We began the Women's Initiative Fellowship with Egypt and Tunisia, because they were the first two of the Arab Spring countries. Dalel Nichin, one of our 2014 Tunisian fellows, as a part of the 2014 Tunisian Fellowship, Danelle developed an action plan with a goal of training female candidates and registering 2,000 women to vote in their presidential election. She surpassed her goal by training 120 female candidates and registering more than 3,500 women to vote. Dalel, like all of our Women's Initiative fellows, believes in the future of her country, and she knows that women will lead the democracy movement. The Bush Institute's Afghan Women's Project supports effective programs in Afghanistan. In celebration of International Women's Day last March, the Bush Institute released our new book, We Are Afghan Women. And Mina's story is part of our book, and I see that you can buy our book right over here to the side. We Are Afghan Women is a rare portrait of Afghanistan today, the oppression the nation has endured throughout the past 40 years, and the accomplishments of its women and their hopes for their future. Mina Sherzoy, who just introduced me, is one of the hopeful women whose story is in the book, and we'll hear from her in just a few minutes. Razia John, who left Afghanistan as a refugee when the Russians invaded in 1979 and finally returned in January 2002, is a remarkable Afghan woman who founded girls' schools in Afghanistan. She wisely taught her young female students to write their father's name first, rather than their own names. Her clever tactic instilled pride in these girls' fathers, who often didn't read or write themselves, and then gave their girls permission to continue their education. In March, Razia attended the opening of the first women's college in rural Afghanistan, the Razia John Technical College. In a letter Razia sent me recently, she wrote, "We're accomplishing things that once seemed impossible. We've opened a door that at one time I couldn't even imagine. This is truly a dream come true." The Bush Institute's First Ladies Initiative is working to engage and support First Ladies in Africa so that they might use their unique platforms to improve the lives of people in their countries. The First Lady of Ethiopia, Mrs. Roman, attended our first African First Ladies Summit in 2013 in Tanzania. At a private roundtable discussion, she asked Cherie Blair, who was one of our presenters, and me, how to build a platform and where she could start. I advised her to begin with what she knew. Even before returning home to Ethiopia, Mrs. Roman worked to develop an initiative that promotes economic opportunity for female entrepreneurs. She launched her initiative just a few months after the summit, and in 2014, she implemented a collaborative project that connected 1,500 women entrepreneurs to the export market. Today, she works from an official First Lady's office, the first of its kind in Ethiopian history. On one of my visits to Africa, I met a woman who had contracted HIV from her husband. When he died, her family shunned her. They refused to allow her to sit with them or to eat with them under the mistaken belief that they might catch HIV from her. She was introduced to a faith-based organization called Chikimbuso, which taught her how to make beautiful purses out of recycled materials. She began taking antiretroviral drugs, and she grew her purse business. Today, through her work, she supports the family that once shunned her. 13 years ago, experts predicted that before 2008, 80 million people would be infected with the AIDS virus. At a White House Rose Garden ceremony, my husband, President Bush, said, "The global devastation of HIV/AIDS staggers the imagination and shocks the conscience." Within 6 months, he'd unveiled the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, the largest international health initiative ever directed at a single disease. Initially, PEPFAR committed $15 billion over 5 years to prevent new infections, to treat those already infected with AIDS, and to care for our children who were orphaned, who had lost their parent to AIDS. The results of PEPFAR have been incredible. Over the past 12 years, PEPFAR has delivered life-saving medicine to more than 9.5 million people, including more than 5.4 million women and girls. The success of PEPFAR encouraged us to take on our next challenge, women's cancers. So 5 years ago, the Bush Institute partnered with PEPFAR, Susan G. Komen, and UNAIDS to launch a program called Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon. The pink ribbon symbolizes the fight against women's cancers. The red ribbon represents the fight against AIDS. For a woman who survives AIDS should not be left to die from cervical cancer, a preventable disease, and the leading cause of cancer death among African women. And neither should her mother, her sister, or her friend. Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon has achieved encouraging results. The program started in 3 countries that have a high burden of disease: Zambia, Botswana, and Tanzania. In each country, the Bush Institute built on the healthcare infrastructure and public-private partnerships that made PEPFAR a success. Working with local partners, we trained doctors and nurses to screen and treat cervical and breast cancer. So far, 260,000 women have been screened, and nearly 14 for cervical cancer, and nearly 14,000 for breast cancer. And now, of course, and the head of Gavi is here, now there will be a major push to vaccinate as many girls as we possibly can with the vaccine for the human papillomavirus, which causes the cervical cancer. George and I traveled to Africa to launch the Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon. We've refurbished clinics, and we've met the dedicated healthcare workers who save women's lives. With support from Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon, Botswana and Zambia have launched programs to vaccinate their own girls against the HP virus. Now, the government of Botswana, led by their Minister of Health, Dorcas Mikado, is using its own resources to expand the HPV vaccination program to cover all girls between 9 and 13 years old. Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon is growing. In fact, Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon has now expanded to 2 new countries, Namibia and Ethiopia. And at the beginning of this year, Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon began operating as its own independent nonprofit organization. Despite the headlines we read, there is reason for hope for women in the Middle East and in Africa. And the accomplishments of Dalal, Razia John, Mrs. Roman, the woman from Chickenbuso, the Minister of Health, Dorcas Mikado, and thousands of other courageous women around the world remind us of that. As President George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush have reminded us, all we know we have is now. So today, as you hear about the programs and the progress that women are making in education, health, economic opportunity, and equal rights, I ask you to remember the women who risk their lives to increase opportunities for women worldwide. And I ask you to think about the women who will make even more progress in the future, the women gathered here today, and maybe even my 2 precious granddaughters, Mila and Poppy. Consider the legacy that we'll leave for our children. The choices we make now will shape the world for the next generation, and that's why I thank each and every one of you for committing yourselves to a good future for women around the world. Thank you all. Okay, now Walter will take the stage.
And we will have a discussion with Mina and the First Lady, but just first a little bit of a conversation you and I might have. And I'd like to start, if you don't mind, with just a personal recollection of First Lady Laura Bush when you were First Lady. And it goes to the ability to have values, to have common sense, and to listen. It was right after Hurricane Katrina, and I was just part of the Louisiana Recovery Authority. And you and your husband came down. Y'all had done so much after Katrina to help the Mississippi Gulf Coast and New Orleans come back. And we were in the back room of Mother's Restaurant, not the fanciest joint, but it was open, at least after the storm. And all the parish presidents were going around the table, and somebody said, well, we don't have the street lights or traffic signals on in the lower Ninth Ward yet. And somebody else said, why? And they said, well, we don't have the electricity on, so we can't. And then the next person, like the Archbishop, was going to speak. And all of a sudden, Mrs. Bush leaned forward and said, you don't have the electricity back on? How can you have the recovery if you don't turn the electricity back on? And they said something about, well, FEMA hasn't. And she said, well, wait a minute, I don't get it. Why isn't the electricity back on? At which point, the president said, yeah, why isn't the electricity back on? That night, the electricity went back on. And I do think that there are pictures of Laura Bush in many of those homes. So thank you for your common sense and your values. We appreciate it. In your book, you talk about being in 6th grade. I think it's Mr. Bain says you have to pick a country, do a country project. Why did you pick Afghanistan, and how did that affect you?
Well, I picked Afghanistan because it just seemed like the most remote and exotic country I could pick to make my 6th grade report on. And I don't really remember what was in the report. I remember it had a blue notebook on it, and I'd drawn a gold with gold paint compass, north, south, east, and west on the front of the cover. But I never dreamed, of course, I would have never, ever guessed that I would actually go to Afghanistan sometime, and that Afghanistan would become such a really important part of my life.
And you went there maybe 3 times, I guess, when you were First Lady. Do you remember entering Afghanistan, what it looked like?
I remember the very first trip I went to Bamiyan province. Habiba Sorabi was the governor. Is she still? I think she still is. Oh, she's not anymore. But anyway, I'd met her before, and I told her that I would come. And as we flew in, you can see in the mountainside of Bamiyan these huge niches, huge, that those big 6th century Buddhas were carved in. And one of the things the Taliban had done was destroy them. So, the rubble was lying at the bottom of these huge, big as a mountain, really, the carved into the mountain, the rubble at the bottom. And the very idea of that sort of disregard, really, for anyone who came before you or anything they left for you, that sort of built environment that somebody, 6th century that came before you, left, and then to destroy it in one day like they did is really hard for us to believe. It's kind of hard to imagine, and I think it shows really that both ignorance, the ignorance of the value of things that people built before us, that brought what life was like before us, and the ignorance of our own history. I think that shows.
You may know that Ashraf Ghani actually ran a program at the Aspen Institute before he went back on failed states. Then he went back. He's now the president of Afghanistan. Have you been working with his wife, and what do you do together with her?
Yes, Mrs. Ghani has been to the Bush Center. She right after they were elected. She's part of the Afghan Women's Council that we have that was actually founded right after September 11th, when American women started looking at our sisters in Afghanistan and imagining what their lives were like. And so a lot of people really wanted to do something. So we formed the U.S. Afghan Women's Council. Hillary Clinton's on the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, and then another number of Afghan women as well. And people like Connie Duckworth, who was a businesswoman who founded Arzu, which is a rug-making business. She just looked at Afghanistan and wanted to figure out a way to employ women so they would have some sort of independence. And she knew that rug-making would be a tradition in some parts of Afghanistan. So she immediately went over there right after September 11th and employed women there. And I ordered rugs for the White House from our zoo, and then at the Bush Library in our entertaining space upstairs, I have ordered rugs from our zoo as well that are there. But anyway, I think what happened, especially American women, felt a very strong kinship with Afghan women, just the idea of half of a country being left out. And what you see when half of a country is left out is a failed country. And that's what Afghanistan was.
Does Mrs. I know she, as a First Lady, she doesn't speak out on policy, but does she feel America should still stay involved? And maybe your thoughts as well?
I don't know that she would feel like she could say that to me, but other people have said it in one of these stories in the book. They hope that our troops won't leave too fast, because if we leave, there's a vacuum. And we saw what happened in Iraq, and it just wasn't successful for us to leave. And so I know they want the security that our troops give them, this security, this feeling of security that gives them some time to build the institutions that they need to build to have a successful country. So I don't know what you think about that, Mina, but I hope we won't leave.
Let me actually ask you, Mina, to what extent do you think the U.S. should stay involved in Afghanistan?
Well, actually, going back after September 11th, I think the existence of the American troops is very important and very essential. The reason being is, the insurgents, the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda now, the ISIS, they come in different shapes and forms. They're all the enemies of Afghanistan, and they want to build this terrorist haven within Afghanistan that was before.
Let me ask you to speak up a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So we don't want another Afghanistan to become the center of violence and terrorism training. I know for a fact, more than 100%, you can ask any Afghan and anybody who has been there for a while, even the American soldiers I've talked to, the minute the U.S. leaves, believe me, it's going to be another training camp. It's going to, you will see worse things in the world that you have seen in the past. We will forget about the towers in New York on September 11th, because now they have this grudge, and they're more sophisticated. They have more information. They have more access. So, and Afghan people are poor. Everything has been taken away from them for the past 30 years of war. So, and they have no choice. They just have to survive, and even if the militias come back, they have to be there and live like they did during the Talib times, the 6 years that they were there, whether they're punished or not punished. Look at the women's situation. So we can't have that back again.
Let me rewind the tape just so people get to know your story a bit, which I read in this book, which, as we say, our friend John Edwards and Explorer will be selling. But you were obviously from Afghanistan. You moved away, and I think you come back in 2002 expecting to stay 2 weeks. What happened, and what have you done there?
Well, I'm one of the immigrants. We moved here after the war started, when the Russians took over in Afghanistan. I was young. I came with my family, and we lived here for 23 years after the September 11 happened. And my father was a diplomat in the past, and then he was asked to come back again. So I went in to just go in and see what kind of projects I can create. Maybe 2-3 weeks I'll stay there and come back. But the minute I landed there, I was so devastated with what I saw in my own eyes, because I had to go to the American embassy and register. We all had to do that because I owned a US passport. So I stood there and filling out forms. I turned around, that this 7-8-year-old boy, young boy in a raggedy clothes, and this is early March, and it's cold in Kabul, barefoot. He's polishing my cousin's shoes. And he gave him 50 AFs, which is not even, it's equivalent to $1. And he left with his little box and moved on to another person. It just broke my heart. I just stood there and pretty much froze, because I remembered how I raised my children when they were 7 and 8, how I was when I was 7 years old, my family, my cousins, my nieces, my nephews, everything started going into my brain. I didn't expect to see this. I mean, I was expecting to see poverty, destruction, all of this, but not this bad at this level. So I didn't say anything. After that, I came to the hotel and spoke to my dad, and that's where everybody stayed. There was only one hotel, Intercontinental, which was all damaged anyway, but everybody stayed there. Then in a week, I went again to one of the villages, which is called Jabal Saraj, and I wanted to see the girls, how they're doing and what I can do. Here I'm looking for projects. I saw the 19, 20-year-old girls, they can't even write their names. And then I related that to my daughters because they were 19 and 20 at that time, and they were so self-sufficient because they had finished high school, they know how to drive, they work, they read, they write, they use the computer, all of this. When I got out of there, I said, I don't think I can do this from the US. I have to stay here. So it was a very difficult decision because I had to ask my family. My father was okay with it. He was very happy. But my daughters were the ones that I said, this is what's happening. Do you need me as much as the kids need me here? And they understood. They said okay, and they started going back and forth all the time. And I got their support, and I still do, and I really appreciate that. Without their support, I wouldn't be doing what I've been doing. Yes.
Thank you. Mrs. Bush, you did something quite striking, if I remember historically, which is a couple of months after 9/11, not even a full 2 months, sometime in November 2001, when we felt we had just been attacked by Afghanistan, you gave the presidential radio address, and that helped turn thinking. It's an important little note in history. Can you tell me about that?
Well, Karen Hughes came into George and said she thought maybe I could talk about Afghan women for a little part of the radio address. And George said, well, just let her make the whole radio address. So I did. And right after that, I made it. Actually, we were at the ranch that weekend. I did the recording of the radio address at the ranch. And then I went into Austin. Jenna and Barbara were freshmen in college. And I went shopping with Jenna at a department store. And the women who sold cosmetics said, thank you for speaking for the women of Afghanistan. And it was really the first time that it occurred to me that people did listen to what the First Lady said, that I could say something. But it also showed me again how much American women wanted women in Afghanistan to be able to succeed, that it was shocking to us when we looked. And of course, it had been going on. I mean, the Taliban had been there, but we just hadn't paid any attention in Afghanistan. And so the plight of women there was shocking to American women. But
we talk about the Russians, which really started this, but then the Taliban, the Mujahideen, come in and they crack down on women. Give us your sense of the history of that, both of you. I'll start with you and then ask Mina.
Well, Mina, of course, can really give us the history, but one of the things this book does is it talks about all of that. I'd actually forgotten the Russians went in. The Russians went in for 10 years and bombed, basically ruined Afghanistan, wanting their natural resources. So the Mujahideen, these militias formed to run the Russians out, which they did after 10 years. But then they started to fight with each other, and then the Taliban came in. And this is what I understood from Mrs. Ghani, or maybe did you tell me this? The Talib means student. And the Taliban were boys who were either war orphans or they were just adrift in some way, or their parents couldn't feed them. So they put them in madrasas because they were feeding them in the madrasas. And then in the madrasas, they were taught this radical form of Islam. So they were boys that never were really even parented, just only put in schools. And maybe they were orphans and didn't have parents, but...
How did this radical form of Islam take hold through this?
Well, Afghanistan has always been a 99% Muslim country, and I was raised in Afghanistan, and so did my family. And I was 18 when I got out. I never saw these things, and I never heard of the name of Talib. You know, yes, it was a conservative country, but everybody had their choices. You know, you want to wear the burqa, you want to wear the chadar, you know, the big scarf. You walk around like this. I mean, we used to go to Kandahar, and my mom would wear pants and a shirt and a little scarf on her head. We would go to the stores, we would walk around in the villages and everywhere. It was not a problem. But I think this radicalism, the way it started, what was the cause of it? It was the communism. Because Afghans believed that communists have no religion. And they have come in and conquered. And so Islam is going to go away, the faith is going to go away, the religion is going to go away. So that was a part of it. And then when they started fighting, which is called jihad, they fought for jihad. And they did fight against the Russians, and they left. When they left, this is where you know, all the radicals that were trained in Pakistan and around the country, they found the opportunity to come in. And civil war started. The civil war started. And during this time, it was a process of protecting their women and their daughters for men, because they are the first victims of war. It's the men and the children. So what they started doing was protecting and hiding, and that, I mean, can you imagine if a boy that was born maybe 25 years ago, that's all he knows, how to hide his sister, his wife, his mother. It wasn't the Afghanistan that was there 40 years ago that it's okay if you go to the movies with your husband or with your brother or without a scarf or with a scarf. So this brought so many things happened that brought this kind of this radicalism of Islam within the country. And the other thing, education went away, our scholars went away, our institutions were destroyed, everything was demolished. So by the time the Taliban came, which was like an icing on the cake for everybody, so they made it worse for women. No one was allowed to do anything. They had to stay home. They couldn't get out. If they got out, they had to get out with their mahram, which is their brother or husband or father. Otherwise, they would be beaten to death. So those are the reasons that brought it to this point.
Both of you have mentioned the loss of history and also the loss of education. Can I ask you, if I may, a broader question? And I do want to have you read from the book as well, but let me move away from Afghanistan for a second to this whole notion of having lost history, of education no longer establishing a common pool of facts. Do we see that all over the world, and even do you worry about it in the United States?
Yes. I mean, I think we do see that all over the world, and definitely we need to worry about it in the United States. I think we see it here as well. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's just all the rise of the internet where everything is so easy, or it's just a short text, or just some reason that we're not really, or maybe it's schools, a failure in education not to really teach history, or maybe it's a parent's failure to not actually talk about what the traditions of your own family are, what your history is, where you came from, why that's important to how you are now. I don't know really how we can address it, what we need to do about it. But I think we see it, and part of the problem, we talked about this earlier with the internet, is that anonymity, where you can say anything, and it might be true and it might not be true, and there'd be no, unless you really went to the trouble to check a fact, you wouldn't know whether it was true. Or the way to comment on people's posts of various types with horrible comments that you can do anonymously and no one knows what it is. I think it's worrisome. I mean, it's wonderful that we have this kind of communication and this instantaneous communication, but we're living with the bad part of it, I think.
Do you think that's helped poison the politics here in this country?
I don't know if that's what's done it, but
I'm sorry.
I'm not sure if that's what's done it. But I do think, yes, I mean, I think it could, for sure, the terrible things that are said about people.
And you've done a lot with education reform. Tell us what you're doing there and how you hope that might help in this country.
In Afghanistan, well, I got to be the one when I went to Afghanistan on one of my trips to found the American University in Afghanistan, which I think is going and is doing well. So one of the things we wanted to do was to make sure girls got to go to school, and there are a couple of million girls in school now, I think. Isn't that right?
40%, you said,
of
Mina?
students are girls, which is great news. That's really good news.
Put that in historical context, because there were women going to school before the Russian invasion, and then, of course, the Taliban wipes that out. So how did that...
Well, actually, again, before the war, girls were going to school. We had the universities, we had the schools. People had options whether to go to school or not to go to school, but women were going to school and girls were going to school. Of course, during the war, insecurity is a major barrier to development, barrier to improvement, to progress, to education, to everything. So people stopped sending their daughters to school because of insecurity of war. And of course, when the civil war started, it got worse, so totally banned. And then Taliban really banned it. But now, over 10 million kids are going to school, which 40% of that are girls. And that's a major
Is the Taliban
achievement.
still trying to fight that?
Of course they're going to fight it. But we're not going to give up.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Bravo, bravo.
no way.
You have some of the passages I think you wanted to read, is that right?
Well, I just wanted to read this one part. One of the women that wrote their story in here, she ends her story with, "In the rest of the world, we live a very fast-paced life. We want everything to happen in front of our eyes. We don't think about the future. We don't invest in the future, unfortunately, and that needs to change." And then she says, "I'm sure other nations have gone through this societal change probably hundreds of years ago. I think it'll happen in Afghanistan. We just have to be patient and not give up. Because once you give up, you have to start from scratch all over again." Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons I hope we don't withdraw our troops, because we would have to start all over again.
Wow, thank you. When you were, I want, if you may, to talk about other things the Bush Institute is doing, and I did mention education reform in the United States, too, if you wanted to touch on that.
We have a principals program with study about what makes a great leader. Everyone knows anecdotally that if you have a great school, they usually have a great principal, a great leader. So that's one of the things we're doing with school, with American education that we're working on. What else, Holly? Oh, yeah, middle school. Middle school matters. Everyone who's had a teenager knows what middle school is like. And it's sort of the last place for any research to be done about what works. We have a lot of early childhood research and, of course, research in high schools. So we're working on middle school matters and trying to come up with the best ways for middle schools to function. And we have some research already on that that we're doing. So those are the two domestic education programs we're working on at the Bush Institute.
And to get back to the hurricane, right afterwards, you tried to get every library in the affected areas rebuilt, and especially the history sections of every library. Why was that?
Well, I had a foundation, the Laura Bush Foundation for America's Libraries, that still goes on today, that gives money to school libraries for new books. And I'd had my closing meeting with my funders, the people who had raised the money for our endowment, at the White House right after the hurricanes. And I said to them, I can't get those schools out of mine. And one of my friends who was on the committee with all the people who raised the money said, let's just raise money and give cash for cash. So we started giving big grants to middle school, to elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools in New Orleans, all across the Louisiana coast, one or a couple of them in Alabama, a couple, I think, on the Florida Gulf Coast as well, some in Mississippi. We gave big grants, $150,000, which is what a basic school, high school library collection would be, and about $55,000 to an elementary collection, which is what just, if you just went to the basic collection that you would buy for a school library, that's what we gave to schools. And I think we gave 132 schools across the Gulf Coast that rebuilt their libraries.
You also do a wonderful leadership institute at the Bush Institute. I don't know, is Graham Vesey here? Are you around? You know, Graham is kind of in charge of running all of the Aspen Institute. We also, I mean, the Ideas Fest, logistically, we almost couldn't put on this conference because you chose him, and he was down in Austin 2 weeks ago.
So this was Margaret
that.
Spelling's idea, who was our head of the Bush Library. She's gone now to be the chancellor of the University of North Carolina.
Oh, dear.
But she's having a great time. Just kidding. But anyway, she is really. But just the bathroom bill kind of got her. But
Any thoughts on that?
yeah. But anyway, she had this idea partnering with our 4 regional presidential libraries, LBJ's library in Austin, the George H.W. Bush Library in College Station, our library, and Bill Clinton's library in Little Rock. So we we pick sort of mid-career people, and they're very distinguished already, like your Graham that works for you. And they go to all of those 4 presidential libraries. They study in each case decisions that those presidents made and what went into that decision making. And then they're supposed to, and they do, each develop their own program of some sort that they develop while they're going up to the presidential libraries. So
what was the decision case
so the
that
one
your
that
husband
they do at our library is why George made the decision to bail out the banks in 2008 at the financial meltdown. President Johnson's, it's how he shepherded the civil rights laws. Let's see, President George H.W. Bush's was the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and his decisions that went around that. The decision, for instance, not to go to Germany, that it was a German celebration, that the American president didn't need to go when the Berlin Wall fell, which I think just shows his great humility and sense, President George H.W. Bush. And I'm not sure what Bill Clinton's is, but anyway, no, it's something good. I think it's welfare reform, but I'm not positive if that's what it is, how he got welfare reform.
Let's to keep that on the record.
Yeah, exactly.
Welfare reform.
That's right. But anyway, so next week, they go to each one of the libraries over weekends. They all work. They're all mid-career people. They're all distinguished, really, in their own professions. And so next week, I think, or week after next, is their final visit to the Clinton Library, and George will be there, and Tony Blair will be there with them.
Now, wait, I have to picture this. The Cleveland Convention will be opening that week, and your husband will be with Bill Clinton in Little Rock.
Yeah, exactly. It'll make an interesting photo op.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. Can we? Actually, this is what's good about America, by the way. It really is.
I will say that I was with now I can't remember. I think it was the First Lady of Ethiopia, but it might have been Tanzania. In Washington, I was meeting with her about pink ribbon, red ribbon, but George and I were in Washington because that night all the former presidents were honoring President Bush. And so Jimmy Carter was in town, of course, and Bill Clinton and George. And oh, no, I was talking to the Minister of Health from Ethiopia and about pink ribbon, red ribbon. And I told him, I said, we're in town because all the presidents are here to honor George's dad. And he said, you just don't know you just don't know what that means to the rest of the world. He said, in Africa, you might not even ever speak to the person, or maybe they never leave office. You're elected, but they never leave, and you come in. And he said, you just don't know what an example it is to the rest of the world to see all the American presidents together. And I think that's great.
I'll get to you in a moment, but let me ask another couple. And you are working, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, now with Michelle Obama at the end of this summer, the two of you, to celebrate.
We're the co-chairs of the Centennial of the National Park Service, which is this August 2016. So I've hiked in a national park every summer for 30 years, and with childhood friends of mine in Midland. I mean, we've hiked in everyone from the Everglades to Yosemite. And that one year we took our girls with us on the Grand Canyon, float down the Colorado River, hike out the South Rim, and then we never invited them again.
What are you doing this year?
This year we're going to hike in the fall on the Appalachian Trail and end up at the Biltmore.
Oh, good. They have a good spot.
Yeah, so it won't actually be that much of camping.
Let me get back to you, Mina. We're talking about you started many things, including the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, I think you've been part of, that came after
I have been.
9/11. Why, and the First Lady mentioned it in her talk, how much can you transform the world by focusing on women?
I think, like the way Mrs. Bush mentioned earlier, without transforming women, without getting women involved, I don't think we can progress. I don't think we can achieve. I don't think we can bring peace to this world. And for me, being in Afghanistan for 14 years and also being a member of the South Asian Women Network, which includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Burma, Nepal, Maldives, Bhutan. I mean, and I've been a member of that network for 7 years, and we meet twice a year to talk about our challenges and learn from each other how they have overcome the barriers and problems. And it's in all sectors: health, education, economic empowerment, technology. One thing that I have discovered for myself, that every country that I just mentioned, half of the population is women. And here we are sitting going, okay, the way I see it, that whole belt, right, as I spoke, half of it is paralyzed. Women's rights are not practiced. Women's rights are not
protected.
Are protected. They are abused, discriminated against.
Not protected, yes.
Yes. So all of this, when you do this to half of the population, and there is poverty, no education, no support, of course there's going to be terrorism. Of course you're not going to see peace in that area. And if like I went to India, to small villages and Bangladesh, everywhere, you see how women are used and abused. Sometimes I would forget about Afghanistan. I'm going, oh my God, this is not just in Afghanistan, it's that whole region. We have to come up with a strategy. We have to come up with programs that really link to, that links all these countries in order to help women, to empower women. And so once a woman is empowered, the whole community is empowered. Their children are empowered. Women are great managers outside and at home. So they become better managers. So from what I have seen, from my experience, we have to empower women.
And do you think the empowerment, sorry, you can, don't mean to step on your applause line. Do you think that the empowerment of women could be an effective bulwark against radicalism and terrorism that we're so struggling with today?
Of course, big time. Mm-hmm. You spend some time in that region, and then you'll see for yourself. Because that woman is not educated, child marriage. You have 10 children. This woman has 10 children, poverty. She sells 2 children in order to accommodate the other 8. I mean, this goes on and on and on and on. So, of course, the insurgents, they take advantage of the situation. And they love it. They keep buying and selling these children. There's a lot of trafficking in that region. And I think the next session is Sunita, who will be talking about child marriage. So child marriage is another problem. They sell the girls mostly. And that's the unfortunate things. And we have to change this. We have to bring change if we want peace. Yes, it is a part of peace. We have to empower women. Every girl that's born in anywhere in the world, I think we need to, if I was a big leader, I would make it mandatory for every family to send their daughter to school no matter what. That's it.
Wow.
So if I had the power.
And when you created the U.S. Afghan councils and all that, were you originally going to focus on women, and how much has that deepened?
Yes, I mean, it was all about women. That's what it definitely was about, because the shock of seeing half a population left out and what that meant for the country, which was, destroyed. It was a failed country. And so the U.S. Afghan Women's Council and the U.S. Afghan Women's Project, all of it is focused on women. The fact is, in countries like that where women's rights are not, observed, or they are marginalized, it's the same for men. Men are treated in the very same way. I mean, these are countries where no one's rights really are in any way protected.
I know that Mrs. Clinton, when she was secretary, made this very much of a push. I'm just wondering, to what extent did you all talk about that? Have you dealt with her when she was secretary on the women's initiative she did in Afghanistan?
Not really. Yes, of course I've seen her, and we know that we see eye to eye on every one of those issues. We don't even really need to talk about it. But I watched what she did and thought it was very interesting and great, and I'm sure she felt the very same way when we started working. I mean, she was an original member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, so we would have worked together on those issues as well.
So what else should we be doing in Afghanistan for your country? You're going to stay there, right?
Yes, I keep going back and forth. I just came back on Thursday. So I think for me, it would be education and empowerment through skill development. Because we have a country that's 80 to 90% illiterate. Mm-hmm. And when you have illiteracy, yes, the younger generation, they have to go to school, but you have got the middle and the elderly that they don't know nothing, most of them. Mm-hmm. So accelerated literacy classes are very important. And the other thing that's important is to teach them skills. Teach them how to earn a living and how to just to be a guide. This is what's needed. Yes, we are pouring a lot of money into military. I believe in military, but I also believe in empowerment. We can have a beautiful military when the people are poor. So what's the use of having a nice military? We should spend as much money on building capacity of people in order to avoid the military. So once they have food on the table, they're not going to go out there and join the insurgents or do anything drastic to their own country. I'll give you one example. When I started my NGO, it was for women, for widows. Because I had just gone from here, so I was in a totally different world. I walked in there saying, okay, I'm here now. Afghanistan has been liberated. We're going to make things happen. Women are going to get out, and we're going to do this, this, this. But I learned by working with women and how they motivated me to work harder for them in order to guide them, in order for them to succeed. At the NGO, we started the tailoring classes. After a week, the teacher came to me and says, Mina, they have to learn how to read and write too because they take measurements. I'm like going, oh, okay, that makes sense. So immediately we hired the literacy teacher and the numeracy. So they learned all this in 2-3 weeks. Or maybe in 2 months, as I was walking into one of the classrooms, this woman stopped me and said, thank you, I pray for you every day. Because I used to pay somebody to find me a rental, Now I know how to read for rent signs. And I found a rental for myself and my family.
Right. It's amazing the empowerment that can
See,
happen
that is
and the
empowerment.
importance of it.
So that's just an example I wanted to use.
Let me, it's about time to wrap up. A quick couple of personal things. Are you going to go back to Afghanistan, do you think, someday?
I hope I'll have a chance to go back. I haven't because I don't really have the security assets, actually, that I had when, obviously, when George was president. But I hope I'll have the chance to go back. I'd love to go back.
And you're spending the summer holed up in the ranch.
So we're going to go off to the ranch this Wednesday and spend July at the ranch, except for when George goes to the Clinton Library with Tony Blair for the graduation of the Presidential Leadership Scholars. So we'll be there.
And what's the president's birthday is next week.
George's birthday is July 6th, his 70th.
Big one.
We're almost the same age, but not quite. But anyway, he's going to ride with Wounded Warriors, ride mountain bikes on our mountain bike trails. He has had a bike ride every year and a golf tournament. But this year we partnered with the Invictus Games, Prince Harry's Invictus Games in Orlando. So he'll just invite alum that have ridden bikes with him before. He's already invited them, and they'll come to the ranch and ride bikes on his 70th birthday.
Nice. And we've been talking about strong women. Let me end with a question that everybody actually wants to know. What's it like having Barbara Bush as a mother-in-law?
Talk about strong women. I told a crowd earlier today, George and I just spent that week in June with them, that it's really always a good idea not to stay longer than 10 days with your mother-in-law, especially if she's my mother-in-law.
Well, she's a wonderful,
doing great.
She's a
really,
wonderful
really
national
terrific.
asset,
And
as are you.
she's doing really well, and she and President Bush they're not so great physically, but they're still very sharp mentally, which is such a blessing at age 90 and 91 and 92. So
Well,
thank you, Walter. Thank you very
Mina.
much.
Thank you,
Mina.
Mrs. Bush. Thank you all very much.